Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello, and welcome to another Transform Justice podcast with me, Penelope Gibbs, and my co-host, Rob Allen. Today, for the first time, we're going to talk about what goes on in prison, specifically prison education. As well as Rob, I'm joined by Ian Merrill, who runs the Shannon Trust, and by David Breakspear, who was a volunteer for the Shannon Trust when he was a prisoner. Rob, you've seen a whole range of prisons across the world. Have you seen anywhere where prison education is done really well?
Well, actually, a few years ago, I drafted a manual for the United Nations about rehabilitation in prison, and education was part of that. And we mentioned prison-university partnerships, which are available in quite a lot of countries now, specialised training for prison teachers in one or two, and a growing use of online learning in South Africa, for example. But despite some individual examples of quite inspiring projects, I found many countries struggle to provide a really systematically good education system for the whole range of prisons and prisoners.
Ian, the Education Select Committee recently said that education should be at the heart of the prison regime. Is it in England and Wales?
Well, I think they're right, but I think my answer to that would be not yet. I mean, we're hopeful that education is going to become more important in the prison setting.
I think we've been hoping for about 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk with some authority about the work that my organisation is involved in, and I can tell you that there is change happening. But more broadly, in terms of prison education, there's an awful long way to go.
Ian, tell us a little bit about what's distinctive about the Shannon Trust approach that you think makes it successful.
Yeah, so what's distinctive about our programme is that it's peer-led. So what that means is that we identify people in prison who can read, and we train them to become peer mentors to work alongside those people in prison who can't read. And they do that using our programme, which is called Turning Pages. So the mentor and the learner will work through the programme, starting with very basic letter sounds, building up into words and sentences. And it's perfectly possible for pretty much anybody to get a basic grasp of reading over a number of months.
And there's about 50% of prisoners who can't read?
Yeah, somewhere between 55 and 60% of people arriving at prison have a reading age below that of an 11-year-old. So yeah, over half the prison population struggle with reading to some extent.
David, do you think that education is at the heart of the prison regime in England and Wales?
The easiest answer is no, but that really is ignoring the good practices that does go on around education, unfortunately in silos and not nationally. The last time that I was in prison, I was released in 2017. I think there was just under 86,000 people in prison at the time. And the Institute of Public Policy had estimated that over 55,000 had been excluded from school. So there's a lot of people in prison that have low levels of education. And when you're talking about accommodation, you're talking about employment, you need people to have at least the basic skills in respect of English and maths to be able to live a life independently.
Yeah. There's a good argument, I think, that providing good education in prisons makes sense for everybody. There's about 85,000 people in prison at the moment across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And 99% of those people are going to be released at some point. So if so many people are going to be released, they're going to be coming to live somewhere near you. And the chances of that person making a successful resettlement, of having, meaningful rehabilitation, I think is made more possible if someone's been able to get some education in prison and perhaps related to that increase their employability when they're released.
David, you've spent spells in prison from quite an early age, I understand. Was education something you personally wanted to do when you first went to prison or not?
No, it wasn't. Having said that, learning hasn't been an issue for me. I've always loved to learn. I think it was Mark Twain that said I didn't let my schooling interfere with my education, and I can totally understand what he meant by that. I first went away when I was a young boy. Back then they were talking about how important education was 30 years ago, and I don't think we've come very far since then. But for me, once I got the yearning for learning, if you like, in prison, it was something very difficult to get back out of again. When you're stuck behind your door in prison, and sometimes you can find yourself being locked down for 3 or 4 days, if you've got stuff there to be getting on with, those 3 or 4 days pass by quite quickly. A couple of books even. So no, education wasn't something for me at the beginning, but it was towards the end in a way, as I matured, yeah.
And that was because your experience of schooling wasn't a particularly positive one before you went to prison. Is that the case?
No, it wasn't. No, I was expelled from school at the age of 14. I'm surprised I lasted that long, to be honest. I was already in trouble with the police, been to court a couple of times. So the decision was taken for me to do my schooling under probation and supervision, which I didn't finish because of my first period of custody.
You said you loved learning. Had school taught you to read, or could you read anyway?
I could read before I got into school. Growing up, I didn't spend my pocket money on sweets. I used to spend my pocket money on comics.
So, Ian, why is it that so many prisoners have poor reading ability when they get into prison?
There could be a whole host of reasons. Perhaps many like David were expelled and didn't get access to education for long enough. The backstories, if you like, are probably many and varied, but there'll be some commonalities, and the school to prison pipeline is a fairly well-known phenomenon, I think.
As a Shannon Trust mentor, and later on as an education mentor, one thing that I really found was that it wasn't the fact that people couldn't, it was the fact that people didn't have the confidence to. If you're being told that you're no good, you're challenging, you're disruptive, you're this, you're that, that really does affect your confidence, and it affects your self-esteem as well. So you kind of become scared of education. A lot of people, once that confidence was unlocked in them, the next thing you saw, they was in the library taking out sort of thick books and then applying to do degrees.
Yeah, I'm sure David is absolutely right. Confidence levels go hand in hand with the actual ability to recognise letters and words, and you can see that grow in people as they do engage in our programmes. Quite often it's the case that if we celebrate that with a certificate for somebody who's perhaps passed one of the stages of our reading programme, that could be the first time they've received any recognition for any kind of educational achievement in their lives, and we're talking about adults here, which is, quite striking, really.
David, it would seem pretty obvious for someone who can't read, who's being offered free tuition when they have lots of time on their hands, that they would accept it, and say, this is fantastic. But is it always like that? Do prisoners who can't read always welcome this opportunity?
Obviously, being an adult and not being able to read, I can only imagine the embarrassment someone must feel in having to ask somebody to teach them to read. So it's quite a powerful thing to happen when someone does come up to you as a Shannon Trust mentor and ask you to help them to read. There's all different ways that people who want to get into reading. Someone might need you to go and speak to them directly. You'll get a kind of the nod from education about people who may be struggling with their reading. But it's quite a sensitive discussion to have, and you have to be very careful on how you approach it.
What, because of the shame and stigma?
Well, because of the stigma, more than the shame, because of the stigma. And what people actually find is by being able to read in prison, you're creating independence for yourself, because virtually everything you do in prison requires some form of reading. So if you can read, the independence is incredible. Regardless if you're behind your door, you can take your imagination elsewhere.
Ian, do you find that some of the prisoners that that you approach in prison are a bit reluctant to get involved at the off, and how do you sort of persuade them to do it, given what David's told us?
Yeah, the work of Shannon Trust certainly, and probably some other organisations, takes place outside of the classroom setting. So if you could imagine not being able to read or even be able to do basic maths, the idea of pitching up to a mixed ability classroom is going to put lots of folks off, particularly if your previous experience of the classroom in a school setting wasn't positive. You will see some people are reluctant to get involved. They might not see education as being for them. But the beauty of a peer-led model is that by training people who are in prison to work alongside those that mixing with on a day-to-day basis already, you can start to break down some of those barriers. You know, they know how prisons work. They can speak the same day-to-day language, if you like, about how the prison operates. Also, the way we provide our programs is important. So they're really designed to go at the learner's own pace. It'll be 20 minutes here and there in a reasonably private space, and you can start to build up somebody's confidence and encourage them to want to do more and begin to see education as something for them.
The Education Select Committee said that many prisoners do have a negative view of education. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, well, the fact that those people have not engaged with education, perhaps in their late teens and as adults, implies that they don't see education as something valuable or something for them. Now, I think you can quickly break down that assumption by engaging with somebody, and I think this is where learning to read is particularly foundational in terms of opening the door to further education. You know, you have to be able to read textbooks, for example, obviously. But there's something else which is valuable about learning to read. I think David mentioned this earlier. It helps your imagination, helps you see other perspectives. It gives you a sense of freedom and escape in pretty challenging circumstances.
Yeah, David, thinking about education a bit more broadly beyond the basics of reading, do you think more could be done and should be done to incentivise prisoners to take part? I mean, I've come across countries where sentences can get reduced if people participate in education programmes. I've heard it said that some prisoners prefer to work because they can earn more money than if they go to classes and stuff. Is that something that you've thought a bit about?
Yeah. Really, it's not whether or not people want to do education, it's whether or not they can afford to do education in prison. If you're coming from a deprived area and finances are a struggle for your family and loved ones, you're going to find yourself quite hungry because the food on offer isn't great, nor is it enough. So you have to supplement that by buying items each week from the canteen. So if you're being offered a job for £20-25 a week packing, or you're being offered £10 a week in education, you're going to go packing. It's as simple as that. So education for me should be the highest paid activity, because without it, it's going to be very difficult to move on to employment. And I don't think achievement in prison, especially for people that have not achieved before, should ever be underestimated. Even in reducing reoffending, someone starting to achieve, they catch the bug and they go on to achieve and achieve and achieve and achieve. And the next thing you know, they've turned their life around and they've walked away from the criminal justice system, perhaps for the first time in several years.
Well, what about the idea of reducing sentence lengths or giving people some sort of credit? Do you think that's a step too far or something that should be considered?
Reducing sentence lengths would be nice, but a lot of people who are have low level of education are also people that are trapped in revolving doors of crisis and crime. They're also people who are serving short-term sentences. So it's having the opportunity and the time to be able to access what it is that's on offer.
It seems to me that people, whether in prison or out, respond to incentives. So there's a thread here. You know, if we recognise that education is an important part of rehabilitation and we're taking rehabilitation seriously, then we should be able to debate issues like how do you further incentivise engagement in education in a prison setting, but sometimes it's difficult to do that because, in the public consciousness, quite often prison is about punishment. And the idea that you could be paid to take part in education seems to jar for some, but to me it just sounds like a pragmatic way of getting more people involved.
And what about trying to integrate education into things like vocational training, which prisoners might find at least is further on the journey to actually getting a job that they can do when they leave? I remember seeing a prison in Germany once where it was more like a college campus, really. There were prisoners doing all sorts of, cooking, carpentry, electrics, metalwork. It was a really active, busy place. And they were incorporating kind of education into the work they were doing there. Is that something we should be doing a bit more of?
There are moves now to bring employers into the prison setting. To your point about education being integrated with that, then absolutely. It will often come down to the local realities of the regime, I think. But that would be made easier if there was a stronger commitment to education as part of rehabilitation, I think.
For me, education is everything that goes on in prison. It's not just about academic education. If someone's more inclined to using their hands, then why can't they go into the workshops? And the education that they need to do is embedded into the work they do in the workshops. I don't think we focus enough on the individual. In respect to prison education, it's sometimes a one-size-fits-all approach.
David, you mentioned the short sentence prisoners. There's also remand prisoners as well. Have we got a situation in prison where, in reality, prison education is only available for some and not for many, many prisoners who are there?
Yeah, I mean, you can find yourself in an education classroom in prison, for argument's sake, let's say level 2 English, and you've got two guys that are already educated at degree level because there isn't any room for them in the workshops, so they dump them on education. So for too long, prison has been about bums on seats when it comes to education. You're getting people in classes that don't want to be there. They may have asked for art and they find themselves on level 1 math. So you've got people in their cells wanting to do education. You've got people in education wanting to be in the workshops. Again, it all comes back to education not having the priority that it should in prison.
But it sounds like it's not given the priority, but also just to me, it sounds like it's just bad organisation. The right people aren't accessing the right courses and people are on courses who don't want to be on those courses.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got charities like Shannon Trust who are doing what they can on a very minimal finances. I say do what they can, but what they are doing is they are really making a difference.
I just have to point out and just ask what you think, and both of you, about this position that charities are almost filling the role of the state here. So the Shannon Trust is reliant on prisoners volunteering to help other prisoners, which is great. But is that where we should be? Can prison education rely on charities, not charities funded by the government, but the ones who aren't funded by the government?
Yeah. So there is a spoken HMPPS commitment to investing in the third sector. We have a number of prison contracts where we deliver our programs, but we also bring to bear quite a lot of grant and money and public donations to support the work we do. So it's a bit of a mix.
For me, when it comes to charities in prison, I dread to think what the state of our prison system would be in without them. I mean, we've had charities linked to the criminal justice system for years, going back to, well, when prisons were first built. Should they be doing it? No. But thankfully they are.
Ian, you've made a persuasive case. You can get people to start learning to read and write and get them on that journey. But is there a point at which they can then be engaged in the more formal education system? What do you do next with people once they've got the basics?
Yeah, if somebody completes or does well in our programme, we would make sure that person's aware of the mainstream education opportunities that are available to them. And we'd also speak to our partner organisations so that they were aware somebody was making progress in the programme. So that's just basic operational cooperation. I think that can help with that. But I think some more imagination in terms of the curriculum would also be helpful. There is an opportunity to reshape the curriculum, I think, in the coming months as the Ministry of Justice procures new prison education contracts. So yeah, there is reason to be hopeful, because whilst the general summary of prison education is pretty negative, there are individual establishments, I think, that manage to do much better. And there's probably some common reasons for that. And I would suggest there's definite buy-in from the senior management team in the prison. If that management team recognises the importance of education, both in terms of how the prison runs, but also the prospects for the individual people in prison and post-release, then that's really important. And that helps to create a culture of education where people can engage and make a change. So it is possible to do this in difficult circumstances. We just need to see more of it, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, I remember going around prisons and being taken around by a governor. We've come to the education bit and he's just said, or she said, this is the education block, and walked off as though it's an entirely separate part of the prison in which they had limited interest, limited control, and so on. I think that's got to change. Would you agree?
I think we need to flip that. It needs to become the focal point of prison life. And not surprisingly, I'm going to say that does require some investment, but it's an attitude of mind as well. And you can see management teams that are very sincere and committed to that. I get that there are, myriad challenges to doing that, but I think there's a payoff for prisons as well in terms of the culture if there's an investment in education.
David, did you notice that in different prisons, a different attitude from the staff?
Well, this is why I get so frustrated around prison education, because when you see people doing stuff for you, it does give you that bit of self-worth, that bit more self-esteem. And the majority of tutors that I've met in prison, they've all been trying to do the right thing, do the best thing, but then they're sort of suffocated by policy and regime.
So the individuals are doing their best, but they're fighting the system?
Exactly. I mean, for me, teachers and librarians are some of the best members of staff that worked in prison, but they're not a strong enough voice. I mean, I don't want to belittle the education providers, because the education providers do a great job in areas, but when you start looking at the management and the regime and the security of a prison, that's where the issues lie for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've read countless inspection reports that say that there just aren't enough staff available to take people to classes, so that seems to be a problem, the staffing in prison. Ian, what do you think about the role of distance learning and new technology, and whether prisoners should be given sort of greater access to online resources? Do you think that's got to be a way forward here?
There are digital education solutions already. I'm thinking of the work of Prison Education Trust, linking people into the Open University very successfully. It often comes down to enabling people in prison to have the connectivity and the access to the devices. This is starting to happen in a small number of prisons, but we need to see that accelerate significantly. I mean, the aim should be to be able to provide education of the same standard in prison as it is in the community. Technology is obviously important. I mean, we've embraced that at Shannon Trust. We've digitised the programme I mentioned, Turning Pages, and we hope to see it made more available in different prison settings over time. The plea I wanted to make, though, was just to remember the human in all this, because particularly when it comes to basic foundational skills like reading and, to a large extent, basic maths, you need somebody there with you to start your learning journey. That remains really important, and all our programmes will continue to work on that basis. Technology as an enabler, not a replacement for learning.
David, I mean, going back to the practicalities of education in prison, we've got extreme staff shortages in many prisons at the moment. So you've got these kind of pockets of good practice, but do you think there is a possibility of improving prison education across the board when the system is basically in crisis?
Yeah, because what you do is you change your approach. If something's difficult to do, you stop doing it that way and you try it another way. And I think the pandemic brought out some fantastic good practices that were going on in prisons. My only concern is that we'd see a lot more people spend more time behind their cells because of what's available in cell these days. People still need to come out of their cells, they still need to interact, but there are ways, especially in temporary situations, to overcome staff shortages.
That's interesting. I'd heard mixed things about the pandemic experience in education. I know in some prisons, I think the education providers didn't necessarily offer very imaginative things for prisoners to do when they were locked up.
No, they didn't. A lot of people at the start of the pandemic were receiving word searches and Sudokus, which was great, but not very inclusive. But it didn't take long for a lot of charities and organisations that are linked to prison to organise themselves. Shannon Trust, they had to adapt to what was going on through the pandemic as well. And I think there's some extremely good examples of good practice. I mean, Purple Visits on its own, that's something extremely positive to have come out of the pandemic.
What is Purple Visits?
Sorry, Purple Visits is the video chat. During the pandemic, they had to stop physical visits going on in prison, but people needed to obviously talk to people. So they started up Purple Visits, which was a video chat with your people at home.
Ian, can I ask you, 7 or 8 years ago, there was this big review of prison education when Michael Gove was in the Ministry of Justice, this Coates review that had all sorts of recommendations and promised to give much greater priority. But it hasn't really happened since then. I don't know if you've reflected on why that is and what needs to happen to give prison education the priority it deserves.
Yeah, so a good way of summarising Coates probably is it brought together all the best thinking around education. And so we have, a menu of solutions already. Many of its recommendations are yet to bear fruit or even be implemented. So what may be lacking is the political will. Perhaps prisons are not seen as that higher priority, certainly not the rehabilitation aspect. We know that there's quite a turnover within the Justice Department, so it makes it difficult to drive through any sustained change.
Funny enough, I've got it written down, recommendations, solutions, the only thing missing is the will. A lot of people talk about prison education, again, as some form of punishment rather than achievements. So I think it needs to be reframed, not just for people out of prison, but also people in prison as well. And the more positive stories we hear about the impact prison education has, the better.
That's well said. I mean, the irony is a lot of, where school doesn't work, it's because it's seen as a punishment. So it's interesting to hear that it can be seen like that in prison too.
Well, yeah, exactly. And we've got to remember as well that basically prison are trying to deal with the people that schools couldn't.
That's opened up a big new issue, perhaps for another podcast that we could do in the future. But I think we should probably try and draw the strands together on this one. Can I ask each of you in turn, if there was one thing, if you were Minister of Justice or Education, that you would do to improve prison education, what would it be? Ian, can I start with you?
Yeah, I'll keep mine very straightforward. So I would want any member of the government or indeed HMPPS to see real examples of what difference education and in particular learning to read can make to an individual. I mean, we have many case studies that we communicate on a regular basis, but I think there's something particularly valuable about a politician or a civil servant meeting individuals for whom education has made a real difference, because that just leaves an imprint upon them, which you hope then turns into policy development and improvements in the system.
And what about you, David?
Yeah, for me, mine's induction, the initial days of someone's entry into prison. To make sure that someone gets the right education, we need to be doing the right induction and the right screening. There's a lot of undiagnosed conditions in prison. And we then expect people to be able to follow the rules and regulations in prison that aren't easy to follow for someone that has an education. So for someone that has low levels of education, prison must be a very, very scary environment. And of course, if you're scared about something, you're going to react in ways that you wouldn't usually react. And then you're going to be labelled as troublesome.
Yep, I can see that. Rob, what one thing might you do?
Well, I'm mindful the government are building 20,000 new prison places, rightly or wrongly in my mind. But one thing they could do if they're going to build some of them is try and ensure that in these new places they get education right. And they could do a lot worse than talk to David and Ian about what to do in these new places, it seems to me.
Agree. Thanks, Rob, David and Ian. And if you'd like to find out more about prison education in general, the Shannon Trust in particular, and about David's writing, do look at our programme notes. And if you're enjoying the podcast, do subscribe to it so you get a notification about new podcasts. Thanks again, and bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.